Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd also like to acknowledge Professor Noor Buchholz for the vision of this kind of meeting and for being the champion and taking it forward, and for inviting me. So we heard earlier that the prevalence and incidence of stones is increasing worldwide. That's what the table shows. So to some extent then, this is somewhat of a poor indictment of our clinical practices and of the research efforts that drive those clinical practices. And so in this presentation, I want to talk about both the clinical aspects and the research aspects of a physicochemical approach. Now, as far as the physicochemistry is concerned, clearly there are two systems at our disposal. There are the stones themselves, and there's the urine. So if we start with the stones, there have been many big, major studies involving thousands and thousands of stones over the last 40 or 50 years. And what these studies have looked at is to try to correlate the stone composition with aspects of diet, lifestyle, and urine chemistry, which we're getting to in a moment. So it's worthwhile for us just to take a look at stone analysis. So from the point of view of this aspect, there's the clinical arm of our stone analysis investigation, which of course requires us to identify the constituents of the stone, characterize the prevailing chemical conditions that must have existed when that stone was initiated and when it grew, and then based on that to prescribe some kind of treatment. From the research point of view, we want to probe somewhat deeper and look at the ultrastructure of the stone, look at the morphology of the crystals, take a look at Randall's plaque, speculate on stone formation mechanisms, and then to take a look at whether there's a way to modulate those crystals that we've seen. As far as stone analysis is concerned, for the clinician, I hope I don't need to convince this audience that analysis of the stone is vital. It really, and I'm not a urologist, so I don't want to prescribe, but I find it really unacceptable if this is not done. And the two most powerful techniques are the first two that are shown there, X-ray powder diffraction and infrared. These are the so-called fingerprint methods because that's exactly what they are. They allow you to identify the stone constituents, and this could be supported by wet chemistry techniques. From the research point of view, then there are very powerful physicochemical techniques that allow us to investigate the aspects that I mentioned a moment ago. Now, just to illustrate a very simple example of the importance from the clinical point of view of analyzing the stone, this particular stone has as its central core uric acid. On the outside is calcium oxalate monohydrate, and this is just the opposite. The central core is the calcium oxalate monohydrate, and the outside is the uric acid. Clearly, there's different pathogenetic factors that are involved in these two stones that would be of importance to the clinician. So stone analysis, but stone analysis that respects the structure of the stone, in other words, as shown here, cleaves the stone in half and looks at different sections of the stone, it would be very important. Here, this is now from the research point of view. This is using a very powerful scanning technique. The video, I was warned it wasn't going to work. It actually allows you to rotate and view in 3 dimensions and also to look at the intimate structure of the stone. And there are optimistic predictions in the literature by the groups that use this non-contrast helical computerized tomography, that this new imaging strategy could lead to a better choice of urological treatment for patients with urinary stones. Well, that is optimistic, but future research needs to explore how this could become a reality. So there is a lot of interest as far as that's concerned. And then we go back, 70, 80 years to the statement by Randall that calculus formation is dependent on a pre-existing renal lesion consisting of calcium deposits, the so-called Randall's plaque, which is getting a lot of attention by some highly respected groups throughout the world. And here I have a series of slides from Professor Dordan, which demonstrates the physical existence of what is believed to be a Randall's plaque. And here's yet another illustration from him. And then, courtesy of Andy Evan from the Indianapolis group, who has this animated series of steps with the Randall's plaque, with appetite formation extending into the interstitial matrix, with the urothelium eroding. If you keep your eye on the cartoon, you'll see it developing, urine macromolecules being involved, amorphous appetite being deposited, then the formation of biological appetite, as you see in the cartoon, followed by calcium oxalate formation, and we get this deposition. So there's a lot of interest from the research point of view as this mechanism of stone formation. And again, we have optimistic predictions that this approach will eventually lead to improved clinical treatment. And so from the research perspective, the same comment that I had before, that future research needs to explore how this could become a reality. Too often, researchers make these predictions because it's a nice way in which to end one's paper, but if we want it to mean something, it needs to be further and aggressively investigated. Oh, so coming back to the system, to the different systems, then we have urine at our disposal. And of course, from the clinical point of view, we want to analyze the urine, notwithstanding that the urine is probably collected after the stone has formed, so that we can calculate the relative supersaturation, which we'll come to in a moment, using a software package called Equal. The idea here is to try to identify some pathological aspect of the urine chemistry, hyper or hypo components. Based on that, advise a dietary intervention and then to prescribe medication. From the research point of view, we want to, again, probe deeper. We want urine analysis to look at macromolecules, which is not done routinely in clinical practice. And this would be the GAGs and the proteins. Take a look at what role they might be playing in the stone formation. In other words, speculate the pathogenesis, and then to prescribe interventions in controlled trials. So here then are the typical kinds of components that are routinely measured or should be measured in the hope that the clinician can identify hyper or hypo components. The problem is that the definition of hyper and hypo is not clear. So what we can do is to take, I beg your pardon. So here are the traditional hyper, and here are the traditional hypo. Of course, pH features in both lists. And so what we want to do is to take a look at a global view of the urine composition using a parameter called the supersaturation. And for any chemical solution, this particular diagram applies. So along the y-axis, we've got increasing supersaturation or saturation. And at relatively low values, whatever that might mean, it's undersaturated and no crystallization will occur in that particular system. Then one goes into a metastable zone, which is what urine is, where crystallization may or may not occur. And then there's a value of the saturation, which is defined by the, let me see if I've got this, which it would be defined by this level here, where one goes into an area of saturation where crystallization will occur. So this is physical chemistry. It applies to urine, but indeed it applies to any system. So we can calculate, using that software package, the saturation. Now, and what we find in many studies, but certainly not all, is that the saturation, the relative saturation in the recurrent stone former, or indeed the stone former, is higher than that in normal individuals. But here's the problem. Many stone formers have parameters that are not abnormal. And the relative saturation values do not differ significantly from those of the healthy controls. So let's take a look. Let's ask the question, can urine parameters be used to identify a stone former, or can the relative saturation discriminate between the groups? Let's take a look. So if I were to present to this audience of experts that urine chemistry, and I ask you, you tell me, is that a stone former or a healthy individual? You wouldn't be overly confident in making that prediction, because some of the parameters might indicate a stone former and others not. However, if I show you that, these are published literature values, now you might say that this second group, that's the stone formers, and your reasoning would be because certain of the risk factors, and certainly the last one, the relative saturation, is higher. So on a comparative basis, you would make that prediction, that that's the stone former. But you would be wrong, because both of those, from published in the literature, are from healthy controls. This one, again, it would be the same kind of dilemma that you have, but that is the stone former. So here we have the healthy individuals, and here we have the stone former. So what is the lesson to be learned here? How useful is individual urine composition values and saturation or supersaturation? I think that absolute levels are not of much value. Relative levels, comparing, are useful, and I'm talking here for the clinician, but the problem is that there are no standard levels that are available, as we've just seen. So from the clinical point of view, and again, I'm not a clinician, so I feel a little bit awkward about this, but we're talking science, we're talking basic physical chemistry. What is helpful is for the patients to act as their own controls, obviously. So for an individual, there's a parameter that catches your eye that you want to raise or lower, and so you have a baseline value and you subject the patient to the treatment. And as far as urine analysis is concerned, because we get, as we've seen in the table that I showed you, such variation from one research group to another, the urine analysis that you request should be performed by the same laboratory. So there's some kind of consistency and standardization there. From the research application is for us investigators to appreciate that maybe the saturation, or as I've got it here, the relative saturation, which is linked to that, is not an absolute discriminator. Just as long as we keep that in mind. It's useful for comparative purposes, but it's not all that a standalone discriminator. So there must be other urinary components then which influence either the saturation, the relative supersaturation, if that is the main thing, or other mechanisms of stone formation. And of course there are. There's the macromolecules, which are not routinely investigated. So one would ask the question, can urinary macromolecules bind calcium? Well, just to quickly show you, the log K values here indicate that calcium does not readily bind with chondroitin sulfate. So the point of my showing you this slide is that the typical urinary macromolecule chondroitin sulfate is unlikely to affect the relative saturation. Also, it's in very low concentration. So if macromolecules are playing a role, they would be affecting other mechanisms besides the saturation. And here are three well-known, published and established mechanisms that the research community have published and investigated and confirmed. And just to take from a summary of the literature, osteopontin is a protein that's found to inhibit calcium oxidate nucleation and growth. So that's a crystallization mechanism. And that the inhibition is proportional, depends on the extent of the phosphorylation. And similarly, TAM horseful protein inhibits another stone-forming mechanism, which is aggregation. And inhibition depends on the extent of the sialylation. And so future research should devise strategies for the clinician which can improve the modulatory effect of these proteins. So that's where the future research needs to go. As far as physicochemical approaches are concerned, I think that the time has come for us to just shift away from our obsession with the calcium and the supersaturation at the absolute level. We need to, of course, look at this for each individual patient on a relative basis. I think that future physicochemical research should take a look at urinary macromolecules. Maybe therein lies some revelations regarding stone formation. And of course, Randall's plaque deserves, having resurfaced after all these years, deserves the attention that it's getting, and we need to continue. Thank you for your attention.